Hello again. Last week I posted this photograph in one of the discussions and I labeled it as a scary picture. And I wanted to tell you a little bit more about this. Many of us would look at this and say, here the students are obviously before some great work of art, and they're not looking at the art, they're looking at their phones. Well, there is more to the story than that, and I wanted to kind of share it with you. I won't read this whole text, but you can read it on your own if you want. The photographer explains that these students were Dutch students, that is from the Netherlands, and they were looking at a painting by the famous artist Rembrandt. It's called Night Watch, and he says all of them were looking at their phones or were either looking at their own phones or their classmates' phones, and he thought that was curious, so he took the picture, he posted it on Facebook, and it immediately went viral. And many of the comments were how dispiriting it is to see that today's youth is more interested in WhatsApp than they are in Rembrandt. However, there were some people who said that maybe the students were actually looking at a app provided by the museum giving them more information about the picture. So it is a good caution about not drawing conclusions too quickly. However, the photographer responded that the museum's app, one would think, would be directing the students to look at the picture. And he says that no time really during his observation of the students were they looking up from their phones to the painting. So you can make of that whatever you want, but I thought it was interesting. The picture that the photographer took was circulated quite a bit, and I think it does tell us something about what's going on today in terms of technology. Now, what we want to talk about today is, first thing, I want to ask you, what do you think are the three most important things to know about writing? Again, I'll ask you to just pause the video for a minute or two and write down your thoughts. The three most important things to know about writing. The answer is process, process, process. Now, I don't mean that to be a trick question, and you get 100% credit if you use the word process or anything like it in your answer. Now, I know students are often reluctant to adopt this view. They're reluctant to follow a process. For example, you have the student who says, well, I just kind of wait till the last minute and I write down whatever comes into my mind, and I usually write my best that way. Well, the sad thing is, I think students who say that are deluding themselves. Because if what you do in writing is you just wing it, the word wing it itself suggests an inferior quality product. And my experience has been that too often I do receive papers from students that clearly did not follow a process and as a result did not have a good product. So we want to take a closer look at the writing process. Again, take a minute and answer this question for me. Where or how does writing begin? What's the starting point? The answer is writing starts with ideas. That's why the first step in the writing process should be some form of brainstorming. Now, we'll see a little bit later there are different ways to go about brainstorming. The second step is outlining. The third step is drafting. Fourth step is revising and editing. And the fifth and final step is proofreading. So let's go over these now one at a time. In terms of brainstorming, that is sort of an umbrella term for what could be various ways of getting ideas on paper. The purpose of brainstorming is to avoid writer's block. Now, you've heard the term writer's block, and perhaps you think you've experienced it yourself. And that is what usually causes writer's block is the student or the writer, student or not, student or professional, will simply sit down at a desk and wait until the right words come into his or her head. The problem is the right words may not come. It's important to get something on the paper. It's important to let the words flow without worrying too much about even whether they make sense. Because it's easier to deal with something than nothing. And if you're looking for the perfect combination of words and phrases and sentences before you put pen to paper or before you begin strokes on the keyboard, then your brain is going to freeze up, or there's a very high chance that it will. Whereas, if you get something on paper, the odds are you'll be able to get something out of it, and you are now moving in a positive direction. So here are some of the starting points for writing and some different techniques for the umbrella term of brainstorming. Brainstorming is a more focused activity where you really are trying to come up with ideas on the topic, but you should not censor yourself in the brainstorming phase. Whether an idea seems like, well, maybe this won't fit in, I'm not sure, just put it down. You can always take it out later. You can always change things. That's the whole idea of it being a process. There are things to worry about at each step. In the brainstorming step, you certainly don't want to worry about things like grammar and mechanics. That's for the very end. That's for the last phase of the writing process. Get the ideas out on paper. One way to do that, some students like to cluster, and that involves, making the little circles. You've probably done this or been taught this in a lower grade. You make little bubbles or circles, and you draw connections between them, and you might put them at different levels from the center in order to show the relationship between the ideas that you're developing. That's called clustering. Listing is another way, and this is really another form of clustering, really, but instead of putting it in a diagram, you're putting it in a straightforward list. Another way, and this is very important in our course, research is actually a way of inventing ideas. Because when you read ideas, you get ideas. So if you do a little research on a subject, you might have comment on it. You might be able to use information from it. It's just another way to get moving. Also, talking to someone else about the topic is a way of getting ideas. And lastly, and this is kind of radical, but some people report success with it, and that is free writing. And free writing is a little bit different from focused brainstorming, because in free writing, you don't even care if you are on topic or not. I mean, you're not, all you want to do is get words on the paper. In fact, it's recommended that if you cannot think of anything to say, that you just keep writing. I can't think of anything to say, blah, 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 until you do think of something to say, and you'll get, the theory being that you'll eventually get tired of writing that and come up with something that's a little bit more usable. But it's just a way of unfreezing all of that material that is there in your brain. The most important thing in the brainstorming phase is not to censor yourself. Okay? The next phase is outlining. Excuse me, went a little too far there. The next phase is outlining. An outline is really like the roadmap for your essay. It provides you with a visible way of looking at the structure and the organization of your essay. Now, outlines come in varying degrees of complexity and sophistication. Some people will do outlines that are very, very detailed, and there are systems for doing that where you have the title and then you start with the big main topic, and that is capital letter A, and then the subtopic under that is the lowercase a, and then under that you have the you have the number 1, and then the number 1 with a parentheses, and that's fine if you're that detailed of a person. But it's important to get some kind of an outline, and a lot of people, what they simply do is they make what's called a sketch map, and it's kind of just what you would think. It just kind of sketches out, without too much formality, the order and sequence in which you're going to discuss the ideas. The beauty of outlining, and I can't emphasize enough not to skip the outlining step. The beauty of outlining is that it enables you to see if you are staying on topic. If you are the type of person that tends to wander and get off topic in your writing, outlining is the solution for you. Because with outlining, you can compare each detail to the main idea directly. With everything else stripped away, you can compare it directly and see, well, does this detail really support this main idea? And then you can look at this main idea and say, does that lead into this other main idea? Okay, because your sketch outline is going to consist mainly of main ideas and supporting details. Okay, and so it's the beauty of an outline is it enables you to see both the forest and the trees. All right, so I emphasize that although some students refuse to do that, it's okay. Some people are good enough at this that they can kind of outline in their head. For example, I'll often let something roll around in my mind for a while before I will put the outline down on paper, because I tend to be just working it out in my mind. And some people don't ever need to write it down, but those people are exceptional. So by far and away, I recommend outlining to everyone. Now we come to drafting, and this is when basically you put everything together. So there's a few things to look at here. First of all, what do we mean by a draft? Some people think, well, there's a rough draft and there's a final draft. Well, that's not true. There could be a lot of drafts in between. A draft is simply an attempt. You know, if you go through your whole paper and you only make a few changes, in a sense you can say that you created a new draft, but you might have to do that many times. Great writers have talked about, and I can show you some quotes. I don't have them right here. I can show you some quotes of how great writers talked about how many drafts they went through, and these are professional writers. So none of us novice writers can be so bold as to think that we can do a good job in just one draft. So, but where do you start? That's the question. Well, you don't necessarily have to start with the introduction. That's my last bullet point there. There is no set sequence. Some people prefer to write the body first, and then they have a better idea of what the whole essay, the point of the whole essay is, and they can go back and write the introduction. And then the conclusion. The conclusion is often the hardest part. We'll look at some ways to develop conclusions later on, but you don't I would suggest that when you sit down to write a first draft, that you do try to at least complete the body in one sitting of the first draft, and then add the introduction and conclusion. And then you're ready to move into the next phase, which is revision. And there are a number of steps in the process of revision as well. It's a good idea to read through your paper once for each of these important elements. First of all, content. Do you have enough information? Is it good information? Is it specific information? Are the general ideas supported by specific information? Secondly, look at the organization. We know the basic structure of a paragraph is main idea supported by specific details. So look at each paragraph separately to determine whether you have adequately developed the general idea. One problem that many students have is that instead of developing an idea with specific details, they repeat the general idea using different words, which is hardly the same thing. That's simply repetition or redundancy. Specific details, having too many of them is rarely a problem. Having too few of them is often a problem. The next thing is mechanics. Now, really, mechanics are one of the last things that you want to look at. You want to make sure that you adhere to all of the rules of standard English grammar. You want to make sure that your punctuation is correct. You want to make sure that your spelling is correct. Now, we have some great tools today for correcting spelling and grammar. But remember that no tool that's based on artificial intelligence is really going to be 100% correct in terms of checking grammar or spelling. For example, spell check will not flag a word as incorrectly spelled if it is in fact a word. An example is the word to. If you wrote T-O-O when you should have written T-O, spell check, at least the spell checkers that I'm familiar with, will not flag that. A grammar checker might. Grammar check also, though, artificial intelligence is not at the level where it's capable of editing in the way that a human being is. Because, again, language is just too complex. What it can do is it can flag for you possible problems for you to look at and analyze and see whether you want to accept the change that a grammar checker like Grammarly is suggesting. Now, I mentioned Grammarly and I highly recommend it. I believe there is a free version. So, use it. But remember also that ultimately it's the writer or editor, but in your case they're the same, the writer or editor who is ultimately responsible for the product. You can't blame things on, well, Grammarly told me to do this. You've got to get it right. You're ultimately the one in control. You will get a lot of false positives. Good writers will get a lot of what we call false positives. That is, Grammarly says, check this, it might be a fragment, and either it's not a fragment, or sometimes you actually want to use a fragment, because fragments can be used effectively. So, know your strengths and weaknesses, because if you know you have a weakness for, let's say, writing run-ons, then you can go through your paper one time looking for nothing else but run-ons. And if you are a comma, what I call a comma sprinkler, that is, it's like you have a shaker full of commas that you kind of sprinkle on the page as you go along. By the way, my theory, my rule of thumb is that with the comma, when in doubt, leave it out. Now, it's not an infallible rule, it doesn't always work, but the modern trend is some commas are just issues of style, rather, really, more than correctness or standard English. But if you have a problem with commas, go through and look at all the commas. Look at where you might have left them out. Look at where you maybe should have had a period rather than a comma. Okay, creating thus a kind of run-on. Keep in mind, finally, that writing is a recursive process. And the word recursive in this sense means that you go back and forth. So that you might be in the outlining stage and you realize suddenly that you need more details, and therefore you have to go back to the brainstorming stage And you might even be in the proofreading when you stage when you realize there's some organizational problem and you might have to move a paragraph or a sentence around. Okay, don't be afraid of doing that at any point. I mean, it used to be when we only had typewriters, you really tried to avoid that because you generally would have to retype the whole page to make a significant change. But today it's so easy to make changes. And especially I urge you not to make obvious correctable errors like mechanical errors. I mean, I see students, unfortunately, turning in papers in which the letter I is used for the personal pronoun. Well, lowercase I is not a word. And back in my undergraduate days, I had a professor. I guess I was falling down on the job in one of my papers, and I had a professor who wrote on my paper that he wasn't going to point out any more mechanical errors, but there were quite a few of them. And then he said, some people interpret sloppiness, which is really what it was, as disrespect on the part of the writer. And, it sort of irritated me at the time. I didn't think he should have said that. And I would not say that to a student, to a particular student, so I'm sort of saying it to all of you. It does show that you don't really, at the very least, that you don't care about your work. There are ways to capture small errors like that. For example, you could do a whole word check in Word for the letter I, but you have to check off a whole word, search for whole word, or it will identify every I, of course, within a word. But those are, generally mechanical errors. You understand a few slipping through because you just missed them. I have a long story to tell you about that, but this video is already getting long. I hear a lot of you out there saying yes, yes. Anyway, so we'll leave it at that. And revision, revision, revision are the next 3 most important words. So I think we have 1 or 2 more videos coming up this week. See you then.